Hello, guys. This is the notes for Chapter 14, which is the second round of the presidency. It's called The Presidency, America's Highest Office. So you should get your book and turn to page 306. And also, I have attached to the Google Classroom, you have the copy of the outline for the chapter, which you should print out or do however form you want to use, but you do have the outline as part of your notes that you can use it as part of your notes. So you can prepare that. Remember, this is a video. You can stop it, start it however you want to. So, all right. So in the presidency, obviously, we're not going to finish the whole book, and that's okay. We only have a few more weeks of school left. You saw your email from Ms. Driscoll, and the 14th is when everything ends for seniors. So basically, we're talking about the president. The last chapter we did was on the road to the White House, becoming the president. This is about the president himself, or maybe herself, coming up sometime soon. So obviously the president, as the book says, it's an important position, power, prestige, and responsibility. And sometimes that's handled well and sometimes not. So first section on your outline says presidential powers. First off, he is the chief executive, okay? And there's a test question here. The Constitution says, remember, on your test, you can also use your copy of the Constitution. Constitution says the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And that is his primary responsibility, okay? So that's Article 2 of the Constitution. So in seeing that the laws are faithfully executed, the president obviously has a number of departments at his disposal to help him administer and enforce these that are under his control. It's much bigger than the first president, obviously, but there's a magnificently large bureaucracy that's controlled by the president as chief executive. Over 2 million employees in the executive branch just means it's not really going to be controlled. The president's in charge, but you can't control 2 million people. President also gets paid fairly well. And some people might say too much, but if you compare the president's pay to the CEO of some large corporation, it's not even close, okay? Certainly the pay is reasonable. Obviously, he has free air travel, free lots of stuff, okay? All right, so that's chief executive. If you look on page 309, on your outline, it says commander-in-chief, okay? So that's the second responsibility. There's a test question there, too. That's obviously one of the most important influential roles of president, commander-in-chief of the military, okay? And that basically goes back to our historical premise throughout this country, which is civilian control of the military. So even though we've had a few ex-generals as president, for the most part, that's not true. And so the president has people working for him, but ultimately the president is the commander-in-chief of the military. And so obviously he can use his power to respond quickly during an emergency, which is not only a military emergency, but things like in our current situation, the military can be used. President also has under his care there a national security and intelligence operation that's pretty big, okay? Here's another test question for you. Covert operations, should be on the outline. Covert operations, overt means open, covert means hidden. So covert operations are ones that are generally unknown to the public, and a lot of times even Congress is not aware of covert operations, although some people in Congress may be aware of some of those. All right, so that's the commander-in-chief. And then next thing on the outline says diplomatic leader. That's on page 310. Basically, diplomatic has to do with dealing with other countries. So that's also in Article 2. Section 2, Clause 2 of the Constitution says the president shall have power by and with the advice of the consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur, and he shall nominate and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls, okay? So president has treaty-making power, but that has to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate. In addition to that, the president also has the power of what are called executive agreements, okay? And some presidents have used those a lot. The president can write an agreement, a written understanding with the other head of state in order to do some particular action. Congress has no power over that. That gives the president some small amount of latitude. Okay, he's also the legislative leader. That's the next thing on your outline. That's on page 312. So basically during the 20th century, oops, I dropped my mouse. Okay. Make sure we're still there. Okay, some issues there, technical issues. All right, so basically the president pretty much during the 20th century pretty much has total control over foreign relations, but he also got more and more power over domestic relations as well. The Great Depression, 2 World Wars, the Cold War, lots of technological change has given the president more and more power, okay? So along with the ability to set a legislative agenda, which the president has, he also has a veto power over Congress, okay? If the president opposes the bill that's been passed by Congress, he may veto it, which means he refuses to sign into law. Now, vetoes go back to Congress. An initial law only requires over 50%, 51% of both houses be in favor. If the president vetoes it, then now 2/3 of each house have to override that. And so that's typically difficult to accomplish. Historically, 96% of all presidential vetoes have been successful. A similar thing to actual veto is what's called a pocket veto. If the president just doesn't sign a bill for 10 days, if Congress is in session, then that bill is automatically, if Congress is not in session. If Congress is not in session, the president doesn't do anything for 10 days, it's automatically vetoed. If the president ignores a law while the Congress is in session, it automatically becomes a law without his signature. So there's several ways that could happen. Of course, Congress, if he vetoes it in any way, they can reintroduce it later. On page 312 in your book is a little thing on the State of the Union address. There are 2 test questions related to this section on the State of the Union address. Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution says, the president shall from time to time give to the Congress information of the State of the Union and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. Now, that doesn't say he has to make an address, okay? It just says he has to pass information. And some of our presidents have actually just, Thomas Jefferson used to just, instead of going to Congress, he would actually just send the message over. Basically, here's another test question for you. President Clinton in 1999 was the first president to actually give a State of the Union address that was trying to get him out of office, okay? Obviously, President Trump has done that. But here's your test question. President Clinton was the first president to have his State of the Union address on the internet, okay? That was a modern thing. All right, back to your outline. Next job of the president is the chief of state, okay? So the president's a national leader and a national symbol, okay? As a chief of state, the president represents America at home and in foreign countries as well. And so the president is one that hosts ambassadors and other foreign dignitaries from the country representing the country. Obviously, all these things indicate the fact that the president might be in danger. On page 315, there's a section on presidential protection, and there's a test question here, okay, on the Secret Service, okay? Secret Service was actually established in 1865, but it was primarily established for the purpose of dealing with counterfeit money, trying to stop counterfeit money. And therefore, it was established in 1883, it was placed within the Treasury Department because, again, they're trying to deal with counterfeit money. In 2002, the Secret Service became part of the Department of Homeland Security. When the Homeland Security Department was started in 2002, there were a number of realignments that were done. Parts of the military were put on the Homeland Security, parts of other things. It was after the assassination of President McKinley in 1901 that Congress asked that this Secret Service protect the president. We had several presidents assassinated, and they felt it was time to make it more formal. If you're interested in your book, there's a whole section, page 316 through 319 on the first ladies that you might want to look at. There's no test questions on that. All right, that bumps us to party leader on your outline. and we're on page 320. So the president is the party leader, okay, whatever party chose him. Obviously, remember the founding fathers did not envision parties, and they didn't have political parties. But over time, with the power of political parties, the president is basically, his job as the head of his party is important. Generally, how the president is actually in control of the party, but through personnel in his position, he's kind of in a leadership position. All right, next section on your outline talks about restrictions and interpretations. So remember, the whole deal at the beginning was about compromises and separation of powers and checks and balances and all that. So, so when the executive branch was created, you remember the Articles of Confederation only had a Congress. So when the Constitution created 3 branches, basically the intent of the founding fathers was to have a executive branch that was limited basically by the Constitution and checked by both the legislative branches and the judicial branches, but given enough power to be a leader of the country. So several test questions here. First test question is on tenure, which is on your outline. Article 2 of the Constitution deals with the restrictions and responsibilities of the executive branch, okay? So Article 2 of the Constitution. So Constitution says that the tenure, that's the term of office of a president, will be 4 years. Okay, that's very clear in the Constitution. But it did not say how many terms a president could have. But Washington basically interpreted that 4 years to mean that's the length of a single term, and so you could run again. Didn't restrict the number of terms. So Washington served 2 terms and established that precedent of 2 terms, which was honored until Franklin Roosevelt did his 3rd and 4th terms in 1940, 1944. So basically, we're done with everybody agreeing to be only 2 terms. So when that didn't happen, we had to change it. So here's your next test question. The 22nd Amendment. The 22nd Amendment basically restricted the president to 2 terms. And then a vice president who succeeds to the presidency to finish out a term may not exceed 10 years. In other words, they can finish out a term if it's not over 2 years and then have 2 more terms. If they actually serve longer than 2 years, then that counts as one of their terms and changes how many times they can be elected. The 22nd Amendment also gave some other restrictions to presidential power, which basically ended up with what's sort of a lame duck period. A lame duck is basically somebody who's in office, but who's not going to be in office later. So like if the president has an election in November and they're not reelected, but the inauguration is not till January, then that means they've got a period of time and they have to finish out the term. So here's your test question. Chief executives usually have had a more difficult time during their 2nd term, but the popularity of the president makes a difference. And Congress, is a Congress in support of the president, or is a Congress in not support of the president? All right, your next major section is on impeachment. On your outline in your book, that's page 321. There's several questions here on impeachment, okay? So that's in Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution says, and I'll read it, the president, vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And so this, your test question, impeachment is the ultimate check on the power of the president. Basically, and it's a part of our democratic principle, which is nobody, including the president, is above the law. It's just restricted. So impeachment is like indictment in the judicial system. Impeachment is bringing charges against the president or other major federal officials, and it can only be carried out by a majority vote in the House of Representatives. So only the House of Representatives can impeach. So impeachment, so the House serves like a grand jury. The House determines whether or not there's actually a subcommittee in the House that looks at this, the Judiciary Committee, and they look at articles of impeachment. They decide what they're going to bring to the House. It's brought to the House votes. You should be relatively familiar with this because we just went through this. Basically, and so if they decide to impeach, that's like a grand jury deciding to indict. The trial actually takes place separately. The trial actually takes place in the Senate, okay? Conviction in the Senate requires a 2/3 majority of the Senate. And that's the only way the president can be removed from office or any other official is if 2/3 of the Senate agrees. If laws have been broken, then that's not part of the Senate's job. The Senate just removes the person from office. Then it has to be prosecuted in some other way. All right, here's your next test question. Richard Nixon resigned in 1974 because of the threat of impeachment. He was not actually impeached. Richard Nixon is our only president to date to resign in office. I think that's your test question. And then there's another test question. Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton, and now Donald Trump. Okay, so we actually have three. So that's, but your test I think still says two. So Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and now Donald Trump are the only presidents to be impeached. And none of those three impeachments resulted in removal by the trial. Andrew Johnson's goes back to, if you remember, Andrew Johnson was Abraham Lincoln's vice president. When Lincoln was assassinated, Abraham Johnson became president. And he felt like it was his job as a successor to Abraham Lincoln to carry out Abraham Lincoln's desire to bring an end to the Civil War, desire to bind up the nation's wounds, as Lincoln said. And so he was trying to reinstate the country. It was a much more lenient approach. What we call the radical Republicans in Congress wanted to punish the South for what they did. And so because of his leniency with former Confederate states, Johnson faced a lot of opposition from the radical Republicans. And there's another test question for you. So they kind of set him up, and basically they had passed a law that said the president could not kick somebody out of the job that he'd given a job to. He couldn't fire his own cabinet members. And they knew that he did not like his Secretary of War, Edward Stanton, and so they set that up. Johnson knew what they were doing, and so he tested them, and so he fired Stanton, and so they impeached him and put him on trial. Johnson was acquitted by just one vote. In fact, one of the radical Republicans actually voted against the president being removed from office, and that radical Republican was basically shunned by his party and basically beat out of Washington on that. Bill Clinton was impeached in 1998 for perjury and obstruction of justice, having to do with his sexual relations with a White House intern. The prosecution argued that President Clinton, in trying to hide his adulterous affair with Monica Lewinsky, had committed perjury when he lied under oath and said he didn't have sex with a woman, and then he obstructed justice by tampering with evidence and witnesses, and so that was what they brought him to trial for. President Trump, of course, you know about. Okay, the next thing on your outline is executive order. That's on page 323. The Constitution gives the president power to use what are called executive orders. Okay, that's things the president does that have the force of law. Okay, here's a test question for you. For example, in 1947, President Truman issued an executive order creating the National Security Council, and he did that just within his own power. The president also has appointment power. A smart leader surrounds himself with smart people. Okay, and delegates authority to those people. Some presidents have done that a lot. Some have not done it so much. The president may appoint cabinet members and other aides, ambassadors, diplomats, heads of independent agencies, all federal judges, U.S. marshals, attorneys, heads of the armed forces, all those things. But of course, they require approval, most of them congressional approval. The commissioning of military officers is done by the president with approval of Congress. That's my standing joke, is I'm a gentleman by act of Congress. My name actually is on some congressional bill somewhere being commissioned in the military. Certainly, regardless of how the book says how you define power, everything the president does, chief executive, commander-in-chief, legislative leader, diplomatic leader, chief of state, party boss, that's a lot of stuff. Okay. All right, that brings us on your outline to the next major section, which is executive organization. That's on page 324. Obviously, the president has a lot of responsibility. Obviously, he needs help carrying that out. And basically, the president does that through three major levels of the executive bureaucracy, okay? And one is the executive office of the president. The second one is cabinet departments, and then these service agencies. Altogether, we already mentioned this, the civilian and military employees are over 2 million people. It's big. Okay. All right, so let's look at the vice president first. Yeah, that's actually not part of the president's bureaucratic pyramid, the office of vice president. Constitution lists 2 vice presidential responsibilities. According to Article 1, Section 3, Clause 4, the vice president of the United States shall be president of the Senate, but shall have no vote unless they be equally divided. So therefore, the vice president basically only votes to break a tie. And generally speaking, the vice president's not always there, so you have a president pro tem of the Senate who actually runs things. The second vice presidential duty has to do with why the office exists in the first place. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5 says, in case of the removal of the president from office or of his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the vice president, and the Congress may, by law, provide the case of removal, death, resignation, or inability, both of the president and vice president, declaring what officer shall then act as president, and such officer shall act accordingly until the disability be removed, or a president shall be elected. Obviously, when that happened the first time, that was very controversial. Wasn't really clear. It didn't become really clear until the 25th Amendment, okay? But you might remember that William Henry Harrison was a guy who died after a month in office. John Tyler became president, and that was a very controversial time in our history. Basically, Congress's opinion was, well, you're just taking care of being president, so we picked somebody, and Tyler's position was, I am the president. So the people didn't like him, calling him the accidental president, or his accidency, and he basically established the precedent that the vice president really was the president. Of course, if you look back at your history books, you'll see, again, until recently, whenever a vice president took over, there was no vice president because there was no provisions for that. So all this was fixed by the 25th Amendment, okay? And so obviously the most important job of the vice president is to succeed the president and by death or disability. So as we already said, and by the way, that William Henry Harrison, that is a test question. That was our first test that William Henry Harrison caught a cold, delivered his inaugural speech. Almost 2 hours, I think an hour and 59 minutes. If you remember from all the way back in 8th grade and history and Colonel Robinson, basically people thought he was too old to be president. So to prove he wasn't too old, he stood out in the rain in March in Washington, D.C. for 2 hours, longest inaugural speech without a hat or a top coat, and then died 4 weeks later from a cold. So obviously he wasn't too old to be president, but he was probably too stupid to be president, you know. So anyway, so that's when John Tyler came over. So basically that's your first test question. So for a combined total of 37 years in history, presidents have served without a vice president. So again, the Constitution didn't require that there be a vice president. So President Lyndon Johnson was the last president not to have a vice president for part of his presidency, okay? So that brings us to some test questions. Situation was fixed in 1967 with the passage of the 25th Amendment, okay? And so the 25th Amendment spelled out exactly what would happen, okay? So basically, it spelled out that the president was replaced by the vice president and that the vice presidential vacancy was to be filled by the president nominating someone to be vice president and then being confirmed by a majority vote of both houses of Congress, okay? So that worked out really well because that was used pretty quickly. Here's your next question. In 1973, Nixon is president. Watergate sort of happening, hasn't come to a crisis point yet. And so Vice President Spiro Agnew, who had been governor of Maryland, had to resign. He was brought on charges for taking bribes when he was governor of Maryland, and he may have been involved in some weird things as vice president. So he resigned. And so President Nixon appointed Gerald Ford, who was a representative, House Minority Leader from Michigan, to fill the vacancy, and Congress approved that. He was a very popular guy in Congress. So he became the first vice president chosen by the president and approved by Congress, but not elected by the people. The next year, when Nixon resigned, then Ford became president. And so Gerald Ford chose Nelson Rockefeller, who was the governor of New York, or had been the governor of New York, grandson of John Rockefeller, to become the vice president, which created a situation in American history where we had a president and a vice president, neither of whom had been elected by the American people. Very interesting time. All right. Also within the 25th Amendment deals with this idea of presidential disability. If the president knows he's going to be incapacitated for a period of time, like he's going to undergo surgery maybe, then he can decide to transfer his duties as a vice to the vice president for that time period. Okay, he does this, he gives a written declaration, and he presents that to the president pro tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House, and then that's taking place. The 25th Amendment also spells out the whole order of succession. President, vice president, Speaker of the House, exactly all the people who, in what order they become president. Basically, after Speaker of the House, it's basically the cabinet members in the order in which the cabinets were created. All right, the next section on your outline is called the Executive Office of the President, and that's on page 326. Okay, there's a test question on that. There's a test question on the Executive Office of the President, the EOP. The Executive Office of the President is made up of White House offices and agencies that help the President develop his programs and policies and carry them out. The top aides serving the White House office include the President's press secretary, the President's counsel or legal advisor, and the presidential physician. Okay? There are a number of agencies within the Executive Office that give the President help in management, intelligence, and economic matters. That would include the National Security Council and the Office of Management and Budget. Those are important. All right, next thing on the outline is the cabinet itself. That's on page 327. So the cabinet offices were intentionally invented to help the president carry out his duties, realizing the president can't be an expert in everything, can't be everywhere at every time. And so to help the president carry out his duties and allow for some growth. The term cabinet actually comes from a French word for a closed or private room where the king would meet with his advisors. Cabinet members or secretaries are not members of Congress. In other countries, they are, okay? In England, for example, these cabinet positions are part of the parliament, okay? Cabinet secretaries are individuals who are responsible for the department to the president that they lead. Framers of the Constitution did not attempt to name all these or outline them or limit the number in any way. Today, if I'm right and it hasn't changed the book, here's a test question for you. Today, there are 15 cabinet offices, okay? You don't need to know what they are, but there are 15, okay? There's State, Treasury, Interior, Justice, Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, Defense, Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Transportation, Energy, Education, Veterans Affairs, and Homeland Security. Other cabinet rank members would, of course, include the Vice President, the President's Chief of Staff, the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, the Director of the National Drug Control Policy, and the U.S. Trade Representative. Beneath the cabinet departments are all sorts of administrative agencies, just vast numbers, almost beyond count. Okay. All right, let's go to page 329 on the outline. We're almost done. Last major section, pitfalls and greatness, okay? Obviously, because of the power and authority of the presidential job, the president could be tempted to use those illegally and immorally, and you could argue whether or not that's happening. All presidents make it into history books, okay? All days go down in history, including this one, okay? But it's more difficult to decide who are great and which ones are not. Most importantly, great presidents have had great challenges. Does that make sense? You can't be a great president unless you have met some great national crisis and dealt with that. For example, Washington obviously was a great president because of the establishment of the country. Lincoln was a great president because of the Civil War. Franklin Roosevelt was a great president because of the Great Depression and World War II. If you look on page 328 of your book, this changes, okay? we're done with the actual notes. So basically, there's a list of 2 surveys there, a historian survey and a viewer survey showing ranking the presidents and who was the greatest. And both of them rank Abraham Lincoln as the greatest. I still kind of hang with George Washington. George Washington is second on one list. Basically, the top 4 are the same on both lists. The top 4 are Lincoln, Roosevelt, Washington, and the other Roosevelt. The top 4 on both lists, just different order. And then it kind of varies from there. Both of them have James Buchanan on the bottom. That hasn't changed. All right, so that's it. So this is chapter 14. The test won't be for a while, but this is your chapter 14 notes. So make sure you get all these notes ready for whenever the chapter occurs. And we'll see you guys later.